Charizard EX has dominated the standard format for quite some time. Winning multiple major events, it has solidified itself as one of the most formidable decks in the modern era. The Pokemon World Championships are quickly approaching, and with the brand new set Shrouded Fable, I expect this deck to continue its dominance. If you enjoy the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe and hit that notification bell to be alerted when more of these videos go live. Charizard EX is a 330 HP Dark-type Pokemon with the attack Burning Darkness, which deals 180 damage plus 30 more damage for every prize card your opponent has taken. Many decks can get weaker as the game goes on, but this deck does just the opposite, getting stronger as your opponent gets closer to winning the game. Being able to hit ridiculous numbers towards the end of the game with Burning Darkness allows you to one-shot any threat in the standard format. Its ability Infernal Rain allows you, when you evolve this Pokemon, to attach 3 fire energy from your deck to your Pokemon in any way you like. This fuels Charizard and allows you to streamline them throughout the entire game. Pidgeot EX is the glue that holds the deck together, with its quick search ability allowing you once during your turn to search your deck for any card and put it into your hand. This will allow you to consistently find the pieces that you need to be able to streamline your Charizards and find your boss's orders or hand disruption cards right when you need them. B-Barrel is another great addition to this deck, with its Industrious Incisors ability boosting the consistency of the Charizard deck even more. Sometimes you need to pull off pretty ambitious combos, which the B-Barrel aids in achieving. Many times you'll be faced with a situation where you need more than just a rare candy and you need a multi-card combination to be able to pull off a big Charizard attack, and having that B-Barrel with that Industrious Incisors typically can get you there. However, with the brand new set, this deck gains even more support. Serendipity EX is a brand new card from the set Shrouded Fable that provides a ton of use throughout the game. Its ability Flip the Script allows you to draw 3 cards during your turn if any of your Pokemon were knocked out during your last turn. The cool thing about this ability is it doesn't trigger right when your opponent takes a knockout. You can save this ability to use a potential draw supporter first, play out your turn, and then use the Phesantipity's ability to be able to draw cards. You're not forced to instantly draw cards once your Pokemon was knocked out. Having that flexibility is really important, as sometimes you're not entirely sure exactly what route you want to go in a specific turn, so having that option to be able to wait and then use the Flip the Script can be quite nice. Next up, we have the Dusknoir line. One of the most talked about cards from Shrouded Fable. I think it can definitely live up to the hype. The 2 main parts of the Dusknoir line will be Dusclops and Dusknoir. Both with the same ability name, they do slightly different things. Dusclops can knock itself out and deal 5 damage counters to one of your opponent's Pokemon, whereas Dusknoir can knock itself out and deal a whopping 13 damage counters to one of your opponent's Pokemon. Although they both give up prize cards, this extra damage can create situations where you can blow out your opponent, making up for the fact that you have to surrender a prize card to them. Even just having Duskull on the field in early games forces your opponent to respect the threat of Dusclops and Dusknoir. The final cards worth noting are the 2 Pokemon V in this deck, Lumineon and Rotom. Rotom exclusively is used in the early game with its powerful instant charge ability, building your hand to pull off explosive turn 2s. Lumineon gives you a huge bump in consistency and can be used throughout the game to find the pieces that you need to keep streamlining attackers, or find that gust effect that you need to finish off the game. Let's hop into the list. Here is a list that I built for Charizard. The most notable inclusions in this list are the 1/1/1 Dusknoir line, which gives you so many multi-prize card opportunities, and Phesantippity EX, which provides a huge boost in consistency throughout the game. The A-Spec I have decided to run is Unfair Stamp, due to its powerful draw effect for yourself and also incredible hand disruption potential against the opponent. Unfair Stamp lives up to its name being unfair. You could potentially run the A-Spec Hero's Cape if you want a slightly stronger Regidrago and Lugia V-Star matchup. However, you hurt the consistency of the deck not having Unfair Stamp in it. Let's dive into how you should approach some of the most popular matchups in the game. Hopping into arguably one of the most hyped up decks in the game, we have the matchup against Regidrago V-Star. Regidrago V-Star has been all the talk recently, and I expect it to be one of the most popular decks moving forward. This matchup provides multiple obstacles that you really want to try and avoid. Like recently stated, this matchup can be relatively tricky. There are multiple threats that you have to worry about. The threat of Kyurem being able to wipe your board entirely of Charmander, Dragapult EX's Phantom Dive paired up with Hawlucha taking out multiple Charmander or Pidgey, and also the threat of Teal'c Ogerpon taking a big one-shot on Charizard EX due to its grass weakness, there really are multiple avenues that they have to beat you. Although you cannot shut them all off, you can force them to find all of the pieces to one specific combo, which sometimes can be difficult for them to do. In this matchup, I personally am a fan of going first. Going first, although being more risky without being able to use a draw supporter, gives you more of an opportunity to play the game without having to be worried about your entire board getting blown up by Kyurem or Dragapult. If you are able to go first, this gives you an avenue to evolve into Charizard EX and Pidgeot EX before the threat of Kyurem and Dragapult loom large over the game. This is one matchup where Dusclops and Dusknoir aren't always particularly useful. If you can't get Duskull down on the first turn along with multiple other support Pokemon, I would avoid benching it, as you should have multiple easy knockouts on the Regidrago side of the board with Charizard, and with so much damage being flung around with Kyurem and Dragapult, sacrificing that prize card to deal damage to a Pokemon is typically not worth it in this matchup. However, if you can't get the Dusclops early though, before they begin attacking you, you can put that damage onto a Regidrago V, meaning that you'll be able to take a much more easy knockout on a Regidrago V-Star with Burning Darkness for 240 or 270, paired up with that 50 damage on the next turn. Radiant Charizard EX is one of the most important attackers in this matchup. Oftentimes, Regidrago is able to take an early prize card lead, which means attacking over and over with Charizard won't always cut it. This is where Radiant Charizard can be a game changer. Paired up with Defiance Band, you're able to one-shot a Regidrago V-Star with a one prizer, potentially swinging the prize trade back into your favor. Paired up with a hand disruption card like Iono or Unfair Stamp, if they miss Boss's Orders or Prime Catcher, you'll typically be able to close out the game with one final Charizard EX. Going first, your ideal board is 2 Charmander, 1 Pidgey, 1 Rotom, 1 Duskull, which you ideally can turn into a Charizard EX, Pidgeot, and Dusclops on the second turn. Although this can seem a little optimistic, this matchup is considered to be slightly unfavorable, so sometimes you have to hope to get a little bit lucky on that opening draw. Going second is another story. You will have a higher possibility of having a stronger start with the option to use a draw supporter like Arven or Iono, but you do run the risk of being ran over by Kyurem or Dragapult early. From my experience testing this matchup, I found it harder for them to pull off Prime Catcher or Boss's Orders plus Hawlucha combo than it is to pull off Kyurem with no Manaphy on board. The reason I mentioned dealing with Kyurem with no Manaphy on board is that it's really difficult to achieve a board state of 3 Charmander, Manaphy, Pidgey, and Rotom on the first turn of the game, which means I usually will just go for 2 Charmander, Manaphy, Pidgey, and Rotom instead, as it's more achievable to pull off. Sometimes you have to bet on their deck not finding all the early game pieces, and I would say turn 2 Dragapult plus Gust and also Hawlucha only happens about 30% of the time. And if they miss, you should be able to restabilize your board. Some important notes to remember when playing against this matchup are, Radiant Zard late game is the MVP. Being able to push a 1 prizer to knock out a 2 prizer can swing the game back into your favor. Benching Duskull turn 1 going first is okay, but typically you won't have bench space or the chance to use it going second. It really depends on the situation, and if you're able to go first and get it down, it's fine, but if you have to go second, I typically would avoid putting it onto the field. Force them to find the perfect combo rather than tanking your board state to protect against both Kyurem and Dragapult. Sometimes you gotta force them to have it. Regidrago is a deck that can be a little inconsistent at times, so being able to force them into getting a Gust effect plus Hawlucha can be pretty difficult, and if they miss it, you'll be rewarded heavily. Overall, I think this matchup is pretty close, potentially slightly unfavored for Charizard, but if you use these notes, I definitely think that you can win. Next up, we have the Gardevoir EX matchup. Gardevoir has continued its dominance in the standard format, taking up 6 of the top 8 slots at the most recent North American International Championships, and it shows no signs of slowing down. Luckily for Charizard, I find this matchup to be relatively decent for the deck. Especially with Dusclops and Dusknoir now, you can really aggressively take huge 3 or 4 prize turns with your ability, something like Lost Vacuum and more. Typically, I like to always go second in this matchup. Gardevoir loves to go second, as they get access to turn 1 Arven plus Technical Machine Evolution to evolve into multiple Kirlia, so try and look to go second in this matchup to stop them from doing that. In this matchup, Dusclops and Dusknoir can both be key contributors. Gardevoir's main way of taking knockouts is using small HP one-price Pokemon like Driftbloom and Screamtail that need to damage themselves heavily to take knockouts against you. This opens up Dusknoir line plays to take knockouts, or even Lost Vacuum to remove their Bravery Charm, taking away their artificial HP, knocking them out. In this matchup, really focus early game on attempting to knock out their Kirlias. Gardevoir in this format can reasonably get 2 to 3 Kirlia out max in the early game, meaning that if you can wipe them early game with Dusknoir's Curse Blast ability plus a Gust effect to knock out the other one, you can really begin to stifle their board state. Gardevoir is so reliant on that Kirlia draw engine, without it, it becomes incredibly difficult for them to find the pieces that they need to take big knockouts. If they are able to pull off a big Driftbloom KO or Screamtail KO, you can simply knock that Pokemon out with a Dusclops or Lost Vacuum, and then use a Boss's Orders or Counter Catcher to bring up a Gardevoir EX and take 3 prize cards. It's important to remember though that Gardevoir does have a few lines that they will almost always try to use to beat you. Let's hop right into them. The first line that they'll try and use against you is using Counter Catcher on Pidgeot to set up a knockout and pair that up with a hand disruption card like Unfair Stamp or Iono. Their best bet is to take out your support system first, which will cause your board state to decay over time. So this is where Pheasantipede or Bibarel become phenomenal to stabilize your board after they make this play. Another play they try and make is to set up a Technical Machine, the evolution play, so if you recognize them setting up the damage on multiple different Pokemon, be careful and potentially bench another Charmander or look to Professor Turo or Collapse Stadium to remove a damaged Pokemon in play. They telegraph these plays pretty obviously, so you should be able to see them coming. Early game, my board will typically consist of 2 Charmander, 1 Rotom, 1 Duskull, 1 Pidgey, and 1 Bidoof. If you can get this set up, you should be okay in this matchup, as you will have 1 draw engine in Pidgeot, plus a draw engine in Bibarel, Duskull to be able to threaten Dusclops or Dusknoir, Rotom for the early game, which is especially useful in this matchup as they don't press you much early, and 2 Charmander to turn into Charmeleon and or Charizard as quickly as possible. Alrighty, here are some final notes when playing against Gardevoir. Look to pull off Dusknoir or Dusclops to take knockouts on small HP Pokemon. Lost Vacuum is great at removing Bravery Charm opening knockouts. If they are setting up the Technical Machine, the evolution play, prepare for that by putting another Charmander down or using Professor Toro or Collapse Stadium to heal one of those damaged Pokemon. And lastly, try to get a Bidoof down. They're going to try and chase after that Pidgeot EX and knock it out, so having a secondary draw support engine is really important. As long as you're able to set up and play exactly like I said, you should be doing pretty good in this matchup. Next up, we have the Lugia V-Star matchup. Lugia remains as strong as ever, gaining a boost in this format with its matchup against Regidrago being relatively solid. This matchup for Charizard is incredibly close as both the non-Cinccino variant and Cinccino variants both have ways to one-shot you. This matchup I like to go first against, as there is no way Lugia can attack on the first turn, giving you an extra turn to set up your board state. Dusclops or Dusknoir are really powerful in this matchup as they can make it easier to knock out a Lugia V-Star in the early game, or you can entirely wipe a Minccino or Cinccino off the board. When playing against the non-Cinccino build, really focus on knocking out Archeops and forcing a Weirdeer KO. Weirdeer is really easy to deal with a Radiant Charizard, and if they decide to get into a 2-shot war with you, then cards like Professor Turo or Collapse Stadium can turn that strategy against them. Here's some important notes to remember when playing against the Lugia V-Star matchup. Look to chase Archeopses or Cinccinos, kind of depending on the variant, and you should be able to take out their support system first and then focus on those big Lugia V-Stars, which you can then use something like Toro or Collapse Stadium when you get into that 2-shot war. And if they do try and take a big one-hit knockout with the Weirdeer, look to use Radiant Charizard, which will flip the prize trade typically back into your favor. Overall, I think this matchup is relatively decent, should be okay in it. Next up, we have the Charizard Mirror Match. Charizard EX is expected to be one of the most played decks moving forward, so this mirror match becomes increasingly important to know how to navigate. Dusclops and Dusknoir are everything in this matchup. So much of the time, this matchup becomes a war of attrition with healing with Professor Turo and Collapse Stadium. But Dusclops and Dusknoir turn this matchup on its head, allowing you to more aggressively take knockouts on big HP Pokemon like Charizard and Pidgeot. Typically, I like to go second in this matchup, as letting them take the first prize is totally fine, and stopping them from using Arven on the first turn can make them stumble. It's critical to look for ways to knock out Pidgeot EX as quickly as possible. Look to knock out your Dusclops as fast as you can and focus that damage all onto Pidgeot. Then use a counter catcher or boss's orders to bring it up and knock it out with Burning Darkness. Whoever is able to get the first big knockout on Pidgeot becomes heavily favored, so it truly is a race to the Dusclops or Dusknoir. Bibarel or Pheasantipede become increasingly important in this matchup as well, as you will potentially need to live without Pidgeot EX for the majority of the game if both players achieve their strategy. Typically look to make your early game board 2 Charmander, 2 Pidgey, 1 Rotom, and 1 Bidoof. It's so important in this matchup to get Pidgeot up, and they will be looking to target it down, so really try to get 2 on the field as soon as possible. Bidoof is also crucial to get on the board because without that safety net of the Bibarel, a knockout plus a hand disruption combo on Pidgeot can cause your board state to collapse. Here are some important notes to remember when playing against the mirror match. Focus on knocking out Pidgeot EX as quickly as possible. Bibarel or Pheasantipede are crucial Pokemon to draw with if your Pidgeot EX gets knocked out. However, the Bibarel is better in this matchup as it is a 1-prizer, whereas Pheasantipede can be viewed as a liability. And also, make sure to go second. You want to be able to be the first one to use a supporter. It can be very, very important and will typically make sure that your setup is more stable. Next up, we have the Raging Bolt matchup. Raging Bolt is a deck that has still seen plenty of play and remains a threat moving forward. Raging Bolt's biggest strength is that it's a consistent linear deck that is able to blitz decks really quickly with its Bellowing Thunder attack that has a near unlimited damage cap. However, this matchup is relatively solid for Charizard EX. As long as you're able to set up your board state, you should be okay in this prize trade. In this matchup, you really want to sit back and let them take the first knockout on a 1-prizer, as this will allow you to respond with a 2-prizer on their 2-prize Pokemon, initiating the 2-prize card trade. If you take the first big 2-prize knockout, this matchup should be relatively straightforward for you. Radiant Charizard is also phenomenal, as it knocks out Raging Bolt EX without having to worry about setting up a third Charizard to finish off the game. I always recommend going second in this matchup. Pretty much against any deck that can aggressively attack you on the first turn, it's best to go second. Take away what makes their deck unique and special and turn the tempo back into your favor. In this matchup, I'm usually focusing on double Charmander, double Pidgey, 1 Bidoof, and a Rotom. If my opening hand is really strong, I oftentimes won't even bench the Rotom because you don't want them to take the first big 2-prize knockout. So Rotom isn't necessarily something you always need to have on the field if your opening hand is strong. Here are some important notes to remember when playing against the Raging Bolt matchup. Don't bench Rotom unless you have to. Radiant Charizard is great to end the game, and if you fall behind, it's a great 1-prizer to flip the prize trade back into your favor. And also, the Dusknoir engine is admittedly not very strong in this matchup, as the majority of their attackers have very high HP that the Dusclops or the Dusknoir can't really affect, and you should be able to knock them out regardless with something like Charizard. Or you can focus on their lower HP liabilities like their Squawkabillies, like their Pheasantipedes, and more. Overall, I think this matchup is pretty decent. I think it's definitely favored for Charizard, and as long as you set up, should be okay. The last matchup we'll be going over today is the Lost Zone Toolbox matchup. Andrew Hedrick most recently won the North American International Championships with Lost Zone Toolbox, and this deck has remained at the top of the metagame and will remain there, in my opinion, for quite some time. This matchup is relatively close without Jirachi or Mist Energy. However, with the Dusknoir, you can create some pretty huge 2 or 3 prize turns, making up for not playing those cards. When playing this matchup, look to get down Duskull as quickly as possible. Yes, they can Sableye it or Prime Catcher and knock it out with something like Cramorant. However, them being forced to do this means they aren't putting all their focus onto dealing with the Charizard, meaning that you can continue attacking with Zard over and over unscathed. Just the threat of Dusknoir makes a Lost Box player pretty much have to respect it. Typically, if you can pull off a Dusknoir, you just win the game, and if they are able to prevent the Dusknoir, then they have committed a lot of time into dealing with that Pokemon, which typically means they aren't focusing on your main attackers. Typically in the early game, I like to make my board 2 Charmander, 1 Pidgey, 1 Manaphy, 1 Duskull, and 1 Rotom. You don't really need a Bibarel a ton in this matchup, as Lost Box doesn't play many hand disruption cards, but it can be put down towards the middle portion of the game when a bench spot opens up. Here are some important matchup notes when playing against Lost Zone Toolbox. Make sure to put down the Duskull to threaten Dusknoir and force them to deal with it. Iono and Unfair Stamp as well are really important in this matchup. Lost Zone loves to build those giant hands to be able to pull off those multi-card combinations that can be difficult to deal with, so using hand disruption cards like these are very important. Also, make sure to put that Manaphy down early game to prevent Radiant Greninja. These Lost Zone Toolbox lists are playing heavy Pokestop and Lost Vacuum, which means they have the capabilities of hitting turn 1 Radiant Greninja. So make sure to put that mana feed down to prevent that from happening. One last thing also is always count Lost Box's resources if you have the time. Counting how many Mirage Gates that they have left, how many Super Rods, and other critical counts can oftentimes shift how you want to play against this matchup. Lost Box can be very tight on resources, and sometimes they're forced to potentially Lost Zone away something like a Mirage Gate or maybe a Super Rod. It's always important to see exactly what they have left, because if they're down all their Mirage Gates, you can play significantly differently. If you know they're down most of their Super Rods, then you can play really aggressively in some situations. So really important. Check their Lost Zone and check their discard pile. It'll tell you a lot about what they're doing. Charizard EX continues to dominate, and Shrouded Fable makes it that much better.